My name is Lorelei Granger, and the first thing you should know is that I never wanted a war. When my father passed, I thought the worst of my grief would come from missing him, from hearing his voice echo in my dreams only to wake to silence, from catching the scent of his cologne in my coat closet and crumbling under the weight of memory. But I was wrong. Grief had layers I hadn't prepared for, and betrayal was the sharpest one of all. The letter arrived in a white envelope with a heavy wax seal, as if formality could mask cruelty. The solicitor's office had sent it by courier, the kind that required a signature. I remember the courier's face. He looked like he pitied me, which made me feel exposed in my own front garden. The letter was short, brutally efficient. It said that the estate had been divided, and that my portion had been sold by power of attorney. My brother had acted in my stead. My mouth went dry. I read the letter again, and again. It made no sense. I hadn't signed anything, I hadn't agreed to anything, I hadn't even spoken to anyone about the estate yet. I called the solicitor immediately. Ms. Granger, everything was executed with full authorization, he said. Your brother presented the documentation, notarized. What documentation? I never signed a thing. Perhaps you signed under different circumstances. It happens more often than you might think. It was condescending, patronizing, and it didn't answer the question. I went silent. My mind wasn't quiet, though. It was burning, blazing. My brother, Elliot Granger, polished, smug, with a watch worth more than my car, had always been good at legalese. He was the corporate golden boy of the family. Dad had once joked that Elliot came out of the womb with a contract in one hand and a pen in the other. Apparently, the joke was now on me. He sold my inheritance. The cottage in West Sussex where my mother had hung up lavender in every corner. The trust fund meant for my business, locked away since I was 11. The vintage Jag my father had promised me on my 16th birthday, though he never lived to see me get my license. Gone. Sold. I tried calling Elliot, straight to voicemail. I messaged him, no response. It took me 1 hour to drive to his office in Mayfair. I parked directly in front of the double glass doors that led to Granger Development Holdings. The company logo was new, sleek, the kind of corporate branding that screamed money and entitlement. The receptionist blinked when she saw me. Do you have an appointment? No, but I have a reason. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could almost hear her decide whether to let me through or not. I'm his sister, I added. Tell him Lorelei's here. Elliot made me wait. 10 minutes. 15. 20. Finally, he appeared in the lobby, phone in hand, smile mechanical. Lorelei, you look spirited. You forged my signature. He chuckled, laughed, like I had told a joke. No one forged anything, he said. You signed the papers at the hospice, remember? Dad's last week? You weren't exactly lucid yourself. That's disgusting. It was legal. That doesn't make it right. He shrugged. You were never going to do anything with the assets. Better they went to something real, something profitable. My fists curled at my sides. You mean your failing real estate projects? That hit him. His smile faltered. You know what, Lorelei? Maybe it's time you stopped playing dress-up with your Etsy shop and faced reality. Dad was tired of funding your hobbies. My Etsy shop. He meant Trarth and Hollow, my online business. The one with 38,000 monthly customers, international shipping partnerships, and a warehouse I paid for in cash. You don't know a damn thing about me, I said. I know you well enough to know you wouldn't fight this. That's why I did it. You'll move on. He patted my shoulder like I was a child. I walked out before I did something illegal. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning in slow circles and plotted. I wasn't going to take him to court. That would drag out for years. He'd hide behind legal teams and corporate shields. He was smug because he thought I couldn't touch him. But everyone has a weakness. I found his. Elliot's company was hemorrhaging money. He was in talks to secure a silent partner to save the firm. Without the cash injection, he'd lose the majority stake. He was so desperate to prove himself, to play big boy CEO, that he was letting ego override logic. He was betting on a last-minute angel investor, and I was about to become her. I didn't go through the front door. That would have made noise. Instead, I found a broker. An old Oxford contact of mine, Penelope Marsh, who now worked in corporate takeovers and owed me a favor the size of a house. You want to buy Granger Development Holdings? I want majority control. Quietly. Quote, and how exactly are you funding this secret mission? I liquidated my warehouse assets. I have private capital from 3 business partners who think revenge is good entertainment. She grinned. You always were more interesting than Elliot. We moved fast. Penelope drafted the paperwork. I met the silent partner Elliot was wooing and outbid him in the same meeting without revealing who I was. She liked me. Said I had more backbone. By the 23rd hour, the contracts were signed, funds wired, ownership restructured, and Elliot, he had no idea. Until I walked into his boardroom the next morning. He was presenting Q3 losses. His voice was calm, measured, until he saw me walk in and take the seat at the head of the table. That seat's reserved, he said. I know, it's mine. He looked around, confused, then irritated. What the hell are you doing, Lorelei? You sold my inheritance, so I bought your future. The chairman cleared his throat. As of this morning, Ms. Granger holds 63% voting rights. The board welcomes her as interim CEO. Elliot's face went white, like someone had cut the strings on his marionette limbs. I leaned forward, slow, deliberate. You were right about one thing, Elliot. I don't fight, I finish. His jaw clenched. This isn't over. Oh, I know. That's the fun part. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The office smelled like desperation. Not mine, his. Elliot sat stone stiff across the table, fingers laced together in a practiced executive pose, but the sweat beading along his temple betrayed him. For once, the perfect haircut and tailored Italian suit couldn't save him. He was watching a boardroom turn against him, and the collapse was so poetic it felt biblical. How long have you been planning this? He asked, voice low. I didn't smile. That would have been too easy. I simply flipped open the binder I'd brought with me. You mean how long since you stole from me? Since you forged my name to unload my inheritance and funnel the funds into a failing asset purchase? 3 weeks, Elliot. I had to move fast. You gave me the blueprint. His face twitched. The board members, mostly men, watched us like we were center stage at a drama they hadn't paid for. Penelope sat near the end, legs crossed, poker-faced, already emailing in real time to restructure the legal chain of command. We can discuss this privately, Elliot murmured. We could have, I replied, before you made it public when you sold what was mine. Now we do this by the book. Lorelei, he said, voice dropping into that insincere familiarity that always made my skin crawl. We're family. Exactly why this is personal. I stood, pushing my chair back with a crisp scrape against the tile. Effective immediately, Elliot Granger is relieved of all strategic oversight. I will oversee operational transition for the next 90 days. Any inquiries, legal or financial, can come through Marsh and Eaton. Penelope nodded without even lifting her gaze from her laptop. I didn't wait for applause. There wasn't any. Only the sound of a dozen chairs being pushed back, and feet shuffling across polished stone floors. Elliot didn't move. His jaw clenched, lips pale. I walked out of the boardroom, every step echoing with the justice he never thought I'd deliver. By midday, his nameplate was gone. By evening, I moved into his former office, not because I needed it, but because symbolism matters. The first thing I did was open his filing cabinets. The man lived in spreadsheets, ego and charm, but he left a trail. Within the first hour, I had 5 folders marked with dubious loans and personal expenses disguised as development fees. I took photos. Then I called Emma, my lawyer. We need to talk forensic audit. She whistled. You're really doing it, huh? He burned the house down to keep me out. Now I'm building it back with his name in the basement. I'll get the paperwork going. That night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't drink champagne or post cryptic Instagram quotes. I sat in my flat, lights off, and stared at the skyline. The city glimmered like it owed me something. Maybe it did. I checked Elliot's Instagram. He hadn't posted in 72 hours. For him, that was a crisis. Public image was his currency. I imagined him in some overpriced flat with his jaw locked, plotting. Let him. The next week was trench warfare. Half the staff didn't know whether to call me ma'am or miss or boss. HR was in chaos. Elliot had structured the company like a throne room. All power vertical, no communication horizontal. No one knew who actually did what until I made them sit down and map it out. We have 8 project managers and 3 field agents. That makes 0 sense, I said in the first operations meeting. It was Elliot's system, one junior exec offered timidly. Then let's undo the cult of Elliot and build something that functions. I started bringing in consultants, not big-name firms, real people. Architects who knew the business, former logistics managers who understood rural builds. I cut the luxury travel budget by 70%. Fired 2 execs who hadn't shown up in the office since Q1. Offered retention bonuses to the only engineer with a clean project history. By Friday, I had replaced Elliot's framed vision statement with a whiteboard that read, "No one is coming to save us. Do the work." On Monday, Elliot sent flowers. A white orchid in a glass vase with a note that said, "Let's talk like siblings." I binned it. Then, at 9:03 a.m., he walked into the lobby. Security tried to stop him, my assistant messaged. He wouldn't leave. I met him at reception. He looked less polished, hair too neat but with an edge of panic. His smile didn't touch his eyes. "Lorelei," he said, as if we were catching up over brunch. "You have 60 seconds. He leaned in. "You think this is over, but it's not. I know where the bodies are buried. You don't have the experience to run this company." "You're right, I'm not a liar. So I hired people smarter than me. You hired flatterers. I hired builders. You think investors won't question this? I am the investor. You can't destroy me." I tilted my head. "Why not? You destroyed me first." He smirked, backing away. "You don't know how the world works." I smiled coldly. "No, I know how your world worked. I'm changing the rules." He left, but I knew that wasn't the end. It came 2 days later. A call from Emma. "Lorelei, we have a problem." "What kind?" "Your accounts. They were flagged for financial review." "By whom?" "Not a government body, a private investigator." We traced the inquiry. It came from someone hired by Elliot. He's trying to discredit your funding sources. I swore under my breath. "We need to be airtight," she continued. "If he finds anything that looks even vaguely questionable, old tax errors, minor investment inconsistencies, he'll spin it. Then we bury him in clean paper." We got to work. I called every business partner who backed me, warned them about scrutiny, and collected letters of confirmation, clean ledgers, notarized statements. Penelope double-checked the acquisition path. Emma scrubbed the trust records. It took 48 hours of hell. But we came out clean. Then, it was my turn. I released the audit. Publicly. In the interest of transparency, our new leadership is releasing a financial review of the past fiscal year, I wrote in the press statement. The company has nothing to hide. It was bold, audacious, and risky. But it worked. Elliot called me at midnight. "You think you're clever?" "No, I think I'm ethical." "That must feel like a trick to you. You're ruining our family name." "You did that when you stole from me. I'm rebuilding it." He hung up. By the 3rd month, the tide turned. Clients came back. A government contract that had gone cold was suddenly back on the table. One of our senior architects was invited to speak at a European conference, and we let her go on full pay. The company culture shifted like wind through a wheat field. We weren't perfect, but we were better. And Elliot? He tried one last stunt. He leaked a story to a business blog, accused me of insider trading, claimed I manipulated my way into the company. Except he had no proof, just rage. The blog retracted it in 12 hours. Issued a formal apology. I didn't even have to call. The world was watching, and he was unraveling. Then came the subpoena. Emma served it to him at a charity gala. We had enough evidence of financial misconduct to open a civil suit. And we did. Not out of spite. Out of principle. He had stolen, laundered, and signed off fraudulent accounts. His legacy was built on sand. I simply exposed it. The headlines wrote themselves. Nimes asterisk, ex-CEO faces legal heat after sister's surprise takeover. Nimes asterisk, Candide overall family feud turns into corporate redemption. Asterisk. The Granger Reformation, how one woman rebuilt an empire from the inside. The Piju Hebel P phase. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't go on talk shows. I went to work. Every morning. At 6:30 sharp. Because this wasn't revenge anymore. It was my future. And I had built it myself. From the ashes he left me. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The day of the trial, I wore gray. Not black, too dramatic, not navy, too corporate. Gray, like storm clouds, like balance, like what I had finally become, the eye of the hurricane my brother had created. Elliot didn't look at me when I entered the courtroom. He was seated beside his lawyer, a man with slicked back hair, and the air of someone who got paid obscene amounts to make the ugly things sound legal. I sat 3 rows back with Emma. My hands were steady, my pulse wasn't. The judge entered and the room hushed. We weren't here to send him to prison. Not yet. This was civil. A lawsuit over misappropriated trust funds, forged authorizations, embezzlement masked as business expenses. But it was only the beginning. The court would decide if the evidence we brought forward was enough to proceed with a full forensic review. If the judge ruled in our favor, it would open doors. Real ones. Possibly even criminal. Elliot's lawyer went first. He argued everything was consensual, that I had signed documents willingly, that any irregularities were due to clerical errors. Ms. Granger signed the power of attorney herself, he said smoothly. We have it on record. You also have her signature on a sales authorization that coincided with her father's passing and hospital stay, Emma replied, rising. And we have forensic analysts prepared to testify that signature doesn't match any of Ms. Granger's confirmed handwriting samples. The judge raised an eyebrow. Is that testimony here today? Emma nodded. We have affidavits, as well as recorded analysis. It was dry legal maneuvering, but I watched Elliot closely. He was rigid, jaw clenched. For a man who lived for spectacle, he hated this kind of slow, grinding exposure. For once, he couldn't fast-talk his way out. The judge paused at midday to review documents in chambers. When he returned, he looked less amused. I see enough cause to grant a motion for full financial review, he said. All accounts, internal transfers, and expenditures tied to Granger Development Holdings within the last 24 months will be examined by an independent auditor. My heart climbed into my throat. Elliot turned to his lawyer, visibly shaken. The judge continued. Additionally, all documentation involving the transfer of Ms. Granger's inherited assets will be reviewed for evidence of forgery or coercion. It was done. Official, legal. He was under a microscope. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I kept walking. One of them shouted, Ms. Granger, do you feel vindicated? I didn't turn. I simply said, I feel like we're just getting started. Back at the office, the team had left flowers on my desk. Sunflowers, bold and bright, resilient. There was a card from Molly, one of the lead architects. We believe in you. I hadn't cried in weeks. I closed the door to my office and let a few silent tears fall. Not because I was sad, because I finally wasn't. The audit stretched into weeks. Every day, new layers peeled back. Elliot had built his empire like a house of mirrors, flashy from a distance, hollow upon closer inspection. He'd used the company account to pay for his penthouse, charged private jet flights to development projects, funneled charity donations through shell subsidiaries for tax shielding. I read the reports like war briefings. This wasn't just arrogance. Emma said one night as we reviewed the latest documents. It was deliberate, rehearsed. He thought he'd never be caught. He never thought I'd fight. You didn't just fight, Lorelei, you exposed him. Not enough, not yet. I didn't just want victory. I wanted clarity. I wanted the story of what happened, told plainly, on paper, in ink. I wanted every lie to be cataloged, every fraud outlined. Because people like Elliot depended on silence, and I was done being quiet. It was a rainy Thursday when the criminal investigation opened. The audit findings had been handed to the Serious Fraud Office. I received a call at 8:02 a.m. This is Detective Inspector Caldwell. I'm overseeing the referral made by your legal team. I'd like to schedule a formal statement. When? Today, if possible. I met him in a gray stone building near the city. Plain walls, stark furniture, a room where truth had no place to hide. He was calm, professional. We're looking at 3 potential charges, he said after reviewing the files: forgery, financial misappropriation, and violation of fiduciary duty. I gave my statement clearly, recounted everything: dates, names, transactions, the hospice, the inheritance, the fake power of attorney. Caldwell took it all in. We may need you to testify. I'll be there. You understand the fallout? I nodded. He already destroyed our family. This just tells the world why. News broke the following Monday. Former CEO of Granger Development under criminal investigation. Asterisk. Luxury assets seized in ongoing fraud probe. Asterisk. Sister CEO turns whistleblower in high-profile corporate scandal. Asterisk. I didn't hide. I didn't gloat. I kept showing up. Every day. One morning, as I was reviewing a new contract with the council, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Nimes asterisk. You're not done yet. He'll take you down with him. Asterisk. I stared at the screen. Then I smiled. Because for the first time, I realized something powerful. Elliot was scared. That week, someone leaked my personal email. Thousands of spam messages flooded in. My social media was hit with fake reviews, accusations. One even said I lied about our father's will. I traced the source. It came from a server linked to one of Elliot's old business partners, the one who vanished after the first audit. Emma filed a cyber harassment report, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I gave a talk. The Women in Business conference invited me last minute. At first, I almost declined. Then I remembered who I was now. I stood on stage in front of 400 women. My name is Lorelei Granger, and I'm not here because I won. I'm here because I refuse to lose quietly. I told them the truth about inheritance, about trust, about betrayal in boardrooms and rebuilding. When I stepped off stage, women clapped, stood, some cried. Later, I received a message on LinkedIn. Some's asterisk. My brothers stole our family farm after Dad died. You made me believe I can get it back. Thank you. Samstmord. Vuau asterisk. 3 months into the investigation, Elliot was arrested. Fraud, forgery, corporate misconduct. He was released on bail, but the photos were public. Him in handcuffs, face pale, jaw clenched. He looked small. I went home that night and pulled down the last box from the closet. Inside was my father's will. The real one. Signed, dated, notarized. I had kept it, not out of revenge, out of reverence. But now, it served both. It said exactly what I remembered. To my daughter Lorelei, who has vision and fire, I leave the Granger cottage, the Jaguar, and the business trust. There it was. In black and white. Elliot had never expected me to find it. He thought I'd lost everything, that my silence was surrender. But it was gathering strength. And now? Now it was the weapon that sealed the coffin. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The morning of Elliot's indictment hearing, I sat alone in the back of the courtroom. I didn't want a spotlight. I wanted to listen. The prosecution had prepared a mountain of documentation. Months of audits, personal statements, expert testimony. Every transaction that had once been a weapon in Elliot's hand was now stacked like evidence of his downfall. He wore a navy suit, not tailored like before, baggy around the shoulders. His tie wasn't knotted properly, I could tell from 20 feet away. His lawyer tried to argue procedural delays, claimed miscommunication, mishandling, character references, but the judge wasn't interested. Mr. Granger, the evidence before this court indicates not only gross misuse of power and corporate funds, but also deliberate acts of forgery with intent to defraud a direct family member. Bail is denied. You will await trial and remand. The gasp in the room was audible. Elliot flinched as the bailiff approached. The clink of handcuffs followed. And just like that, my brother was escorted from the courtroom. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure cracking open. Emma turned to me. You okay? Not really, but I will be. The press exploded. Some asterisk? Granger behind bars. Fraud scandal grows. Asterisk. Asterisk sister CEO speaks out on justice, family, and fraud. Reporters kept asking for interviews. I declined all of them. Instead, I started writing. A blog post, then an article, then an op-ed that went viral. Asterisk, what happens when the betrayal is legal? How I took my inheritance back. I wrote not to gloat, but to illuminate. Thousands of people messaged me. Women, men, people who had been cheated by their own families, silenced by bureaucracy, ignored by legal systems. I realized this wasn't just Time's story, it was too many people's story. So I kept writing. I partnered with a nonprofit legal fund that supported survivors of financial abuse. I helped raise over £300,000 in the first 6 weeks. Granger Holdings became a case study in governance reform. We implemented radical transparency, from salary bands to project budgets. Employees who had once feared speaking up now submitted feedback anonymously every month. I read every line. I hired a trauma counselor to speak to the team. No one had addressed the emotional wreckage Elliot left behind. Until now. 3 months into Elliot's detainment, his lawyer requested a plea deal. We refused. I wanted the trial. Not because I needed revenge, because I needed truth. But then the calls began. My aunt, a cousin, even an old teacher. Lorelei, do you really want to see him go to prison? He's your brother. He was always ambitious, not malicious. I didn't answer them. Because they're quasi an answer, and it was this. You can love someone who still deserves consequences. You can grieve the relationship while holding them accountable. You can walk away and still choose justice. And I did. The trial lasted 10 days. I took the stand on day 3. I wore the same gray suit I'd worn the day I took over the company. I told the court about my father, about the inheritance, about the forged documents, about the hospice and the trust account, about the betrayal. I didn't cry. But Elliot did. When I stepped down, I didn't look back. The prosecution rested. The defense called no witnesses. On the final day, the jury returned after 6 hours. Guilty. On all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. I walked out of the courtroom, exhaled slowly into the London wind, and for the first time in years, I felt clean. I went to the cottage. My father's cottage in West Sussex. The one Elliot sold. The one I bought back anonymously 2 months earlier through a real estate proxy. I hadn't stepped foot on the property since I was 17. The lavender bushes were overgrown. The front door creaked. Inside, everything had changed. Stripped walls. Different furniture. But the bones were still the same. The hallway where I scraped my knee running as a child. The fireplace where my mother used to warm milk at night. I sat on the floor of the front room and let it hit me. The loss, the theft, the recovery, the cost. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the architect of my own restoration. The day of sentencing, I didn't attend in person. I watched the live stream. Elliot stood in court, hands folded, eyes dim. The judge delivered the sentence with clipped gravity. 8 years in prison, parole eligibility after 5, full financial restitution. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of ending. Weeks later, I received a letter. His handwriting. I opened it at my desk. Lorelei, you got what you wanted. I suppose that means you win. But if you ever wonder why I did what I did, it wasn't because I hated you. It was because I never believed you could do it without me. That was my mistake, not the theft, the underestimation. Shost, good luck. You won't hear from me again. He was right. His real crime was not believing in me. I burned the letter. A year passed. We launched 3 new developments. Sustainable, ethical, transparent. 1 in Leeds, 1 in Brighton, 1 in Dublin. We hired interns from disadvantaged backgrounds. I taught a free monthly masterclass for young women in business. Our retention rate went up 28%. The company I had inherited through fire was now something solid, something honest, something mine. I kept the cottage in West Sussex. I didn't renovate it. Not yet. I wanted it to breathe again, like I finally was. And every time I looked at the keys in my hand, I remembered, my brother sold my inheritance. But I bought back my life. And this time, no one could take it from me. There's a quiet that comes after war. Not peace. Not yet. Just a hollow stillness where the noise used to live. That's what I woke up to each morning for weeks after the trial ended. Not anxiety, not triumph, just the absence of urgency. And in that silence, I began to rebuild. Not just the company, myself. Every day, I arrived at the office before sunrise. Grainger Holdings still bore my surname, but now it bore my shape too. No more velvet curtain luxury. The lobby now had reclaimed wood tables, local artists' prints, and filtered sunlight. Employees, real people, smiled when they walked in. Because they knew they were seen. We weren't just trying to be profitable, we were trying to matter. The morning of our annual shareholders meeting, I stood in front of 200 investors in a navy jumpsuit and no script. You invested in a company once steered by deception. You stayed through an upheaval, and now I ask you to walk with us into a different future. One where growth isn't measured only by profit, but by trust. The room stood still. Then applause. Not thunderous, but real. Later, at the reception, a man I didn't recognize approached me. You probably don't remember me. I was one of Elliot's silent partners. He once told me you were too soft to be taken seriously. I didn't blink. He told a lot of people that. The man nodded slowly. He was wrong. That evening, as I pored over quarterly reports at home, my phone buzzed. It was Penelope. Do you know a journalist named Carson Thorne? Sounds vaguely literary. He's asking questions, big questions, wants to write a book. About what? You, the trial, the takeover, all of it. I exhaled. Let me guess, another man wanting to tell a woman's story for her. Actually, she said, he asked if you wanted to tell it, said he'd ghostwrite it under your name, or not at all. That gave me pause. 2 weeks later, I met Carson. Tall, quiet, surprisingly gentle. He had one of those faces that didn't judge. I don't want a scandal book, he told me over coffee. I want the anatomy of a redemption, a corporate survival memoir that doesn't pretend to be a fairy tale. You want to tell people how a woman got betrayed by her own brother and still rebuilt a company. Quote, only if that woman wants to be heard. I took a sip of my Americano. Then I nodded. Let's tell the truth, all of it. Working with Carson was strange at first. Reliving everything, digging through old emails, rewatching deposition footage, reading my own words from court transcripts. What was the worst moment, he asked one afternoon. I didn't hesitate. The day I stood in Elliot's office and realized he thought I was disposable, that he believed I wouldn't fight back. Carson nodded, typing. And the best moment? When I walked into the boardroom and took his seat, not for revenge, but because I earned it. He looked up. That's the title. I blinked. What is? Her seat at the table, Asterix. We signed the publishing deal with a major house in New York. Advance donated entirely to the legal nonprofit I'd partnered with. The manuscript was submitted, reviewed, approved. Publication set for October. My life was becoming something I hadn't anticipated. Public. The week before the book launch, I visited my father's grave. I hadn't been in over a year. It was quiet, overcast. I knelt by the headstone, ran my fingers across the carved letters. "You were wrong about him," I whispered, "but you were right about me." I placed a copy of the book at the base of the stone. The cover was a grayscale photograph of the West Sussex cottage. Her seat at the table, a story of family, fraud, and finding myself. Nemes. The book sold out in the first 3 weeks. It was picked up by university courses, translated into 6 languages. A Netflix producer requested rights for a limited series. I said no. It wasn't a drama, it was a life. But I did agree to a short documentary. For survivors of financial abuse, for women in business, for anyone who had ever been told to quote, stay quiet and move on. The film premiered online. The view count hit 2 million in the first month. One message hit me hardest. Asterisk, you saved me 5 years of pain. I didn't think anyone else knew what it felt like to be robbed by someone you trusted. I do now, thank you. Grainger Holdings turned 5 years old under my leadership in March. We held a modest anniversary gala, no fireworks, no glitz, just speeches and stories. An intern stood up during dinner and said, I came here expecting to be invisible, but I've never been more seen. Thank you, Ms. Grainger. I left early that night, drove to the cottage, lit a fire, poured a glass of wine, sat on the floor. The lavender had started to bloom again. Elliot wrote again, this time from prison. A full letter. Lorelei. I know I said you wouldn't hear from me again. I lied. I've had a year to think. About power. About shame. About what it means to break something you can't fix. Ty was wrong. About you. About everything. I've been reading about restorative justice. There's a facilitator who thinks you might be willing to speak. Just once. Teres Turo. If you're not ready, I understand. But if you ever want to ask me why to my face, I'm willings. E. I didn't write back immediately. I sat with the letter for a month. Then I called the facilitator. I'm not promising forgiveness, I told her. That's not the goal, she replied. The goal is clarity. We scheduled a meeting. I walked into the small white room at HMP Belmarsh 6 weeks later. Elliot was thinner, older, but he stood when I entered. Lorelei. Sit down. He sat. I looked him straight in the eye. Why did you do it? He exhaled. Because I thought you'd never fight back. Because I thought I deserved more. Because I wanted to win. At what cost? He looked down. Everything. I didn't cry, neither did he. We talked for 73 minutes. I left with no promises, but with peace. Carson sent me a photo one morning. He was in Italy on vacation, holding a copy of the Italian edition of the book. It read, Con me sotto lo stesso tetto, la mia battaglia per l'eredità. Under the same roof. It was a good title. Because that was the truth. We had shared everything. A house, a childhood, a family name. And yet, we had lived in completely different worlds. On the 5th anniversary of my father's passing, I held a remembrance event at the cottage. Just 10 people, close friends, people who'd helped me rebuild. We each brought something symbolic. Emma brought a gavel-shaped paperweight. Penelope brought a candle labeled lavender and iron. I brought my father's watch. Still ticking. Still here. We lit a lantern and let it rise into the sky. And for the first time, I said it out loud. I forgive you, Dad, for trusting the wrong child. And I forgive myself for not being louder sooner. The lantern disappeared into the night. And I felt lighter. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The last time I visited the West Sussex cottage alone, it was April, and the rain had just stopped. It had become my refuge, a place where I didn't have to be CEO, or a survivor, or the woman who stood across from her own brother in court. I could just be Lorelei again, the girl who once believed love would protect her from betrayal, the woman who now knew better. I stood on the porch with a cup of tea in my hands, watching the clouds break apart like paper. It smelled like damp earth and lavender, like something old was washing itself clean. My phone buzzed. A calendar reminder. Investor Summit, 1 week. I turned the phone over and let it sit. I would go. Of course I would. But for a few more hours, I needed to be away from marble lobbies, branded tote bags, and economic forecasts. When I finally returned to the city, everything was already moving again. Ms. Granger, the French delegation moved their flight up. They'll be here at 11. Emma called. She needs to confirm our seat at the regional panel. The finance team wants to double-check the numbers from the Belfast contract. My assistant, Brooke, rattled off updates like a soldier reading coordinates. I admired her precision. Send the French team a breakfast tray, not just coffee, I said, shrugging out of my coat. And tell Emma I'll do the panel, but I'm not reading a speech. Noted. Also, you got another letter. My hands paused above my desk. From Belmarsh? She nodded. Same return address. I stared at the envelope. It had been 5 months since the restorative justice session. And yet, here he was again, reaching. Lorelei, you said you didn't owe me forgiveness. I believed you. I still do. But I wanted to let you know. I read your book, all of it. It was more generous than I deserved, but also more accurate than I was prepared for. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know I understand now. There's a man in here who lost his daughter to fraud. He's serving 18 years. We talk sometimes. He said he hopes you sleep well. 19 years. I hope you do too. 19 years. 19 years. I placed the letter in a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a document, a marker of something ending. The Investor Summit was held in a glass-walled atrium in Edinburgh. I stood at the podium as light poured in from above, casting long shadows across the room. Reporters buzzed, cameras clicked, and somewhere in the back I saw Carson. He gave me a small nod. I nodded back. We talk a lot about growth, I said, but not enough about root systems, about what keeps a company upright when the winds come. For me, it was people, truth, and the refusal to vanish just because someone tried to erase me. Silence, then applause. I stepped down. Later, a woman in her 60s approached me near the buffet table. My brother forged my signature to sell our mother's jewelry, she said. I never said a word. Until I read your story, now I'm taking him to court. I looked her in the eye. You're not late. You're right on time. The next quarter, we opened our first fully green-certified complex in Sheffield. Solar panels, water reclamation, and every contractor paid on time. We cut the ribbon without champagne. Just a community garden and a little girl who gave me a bouquet of marigolds. She said, "My mom says you made the rules better." I crouched and said, "We did it together." My personal life had been on pause for so long, I almost didn't notice when it unpaused. I started going on walks with Carson. Not dates, just walks. But then walks turned into long coffee chats, and coffee turned into dinner. He never brought up the book unless I did. He never called me a warrior, or a phoenix, or any of those exhausting metaphors. He called me Lorelei, and he listened. It was new. And it was slow. But sometimes, after everything is stripped away, slow is the only thing that feels real. One evening in September, I hosted a private event at the cottage. Just 10 guests. Penelope, Emma, Brooke, Molly, a few newer team leads, Carson. We sat around the old hearth, now repaired, drinking mulled wine and sharing stories. Penelope clinked her glass. To the woman who turned betrayal into blueprint. Emma added, to Lorelei, who doesn't just run a company, but restores integrity wherever she goes. I shook my head. To all of you, because I didn't do it alone. Brooke said, no, but you lit the match. The fire crackled. And for a brief second, I saw my father sitting in his old chair by the window, smiling. He vanished in a blink, but the warmth stayed. A month later, I received a call from a girl named Priya in Manchester. She was 19. Her uncle had taken out loans in her name. She was working 2 jobs to pay them off. "I read your story," she said. "I wanted to know if you think someone like me has a shot." I asked her to email me. Then I forwarded her information to Emma and said, "Full support, no questions asked." 2 weeks later, Priya messaged again. Asterisk. We filed our case. I'm scared, but I feel like I finally have armor. I wrote back one word. Good, Ju. That winter, Grainger Holdings was nominated for a Business Ethics Award. I didn't go to the ceremony. I was at the cottage, kneading dough for sourdough bread and listening to storm wind tap on the windows. The team accepted the award on my behalf. Brooke messaged a photo. A golden plaque with my name, and behind it, a giant screen that read, "Trust restored." I smiled and got flour on my phone. That spring, Elliot became eligible for parole review. I was asked if I wanted to submit a statement. I said no. Let the justice system speak for itself. Instead, I wrote a letter to Priya and to dozens of others like her. Each one had shared their stories. Each one had taken a piece of mine and used it like a torch. My legacy wasn't my company, or my book, or the court case. It was the women who now said, "Me too, and not anymore." One night in May, as I watched the sun set over the hills beyond the cottage, Carson reached for my hand. "You're different now," he said. Then who? Then the woman who thought she had to fight alone. I leaned my head against his shoulder. Maybe I had to be alone first, to see who would still stand with me after. He didn't say anything, just held my hand. And that was enough. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a different kind of silence in the early hours before dawn, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you. I found myself waking at 4:30 most mornings. No alarm, no agenda, just an instinct to be present in the stillness. I'd make tea, curl into the armchair by the fireplace in the West Sussex cottage, and let the quiet settle around me like a blanket. In that stillness, I came to understand something. Justice had already happened, but healing was a longer story. Grainger Holdings, now in its 6th year under my leadership, was a different beast entirely. We had streamlined from luxury real estate to impact-oriented development. We partnered with city councils, refugee resettlement programs, green infrastructure startups. We won fewer headlines, but the work echoed longer. At our annual executive retreat, I stood in front of our directors and said, "We are not here to extract value. We are here to create it. Not just for shareholders, but for the communities that host us, the workers that build us, the families that live in what we design." They didn't clap. They didn't need to. Their eyes said enough. Later that day, Molly approached me with a proposal. What if we launched a mentorship incubator for female-led startups in underrepresented neighborhoods? Not charity, investment with muscle. I grinned. Pitch it to the board. I'll back it. We called it Project Foundry. Within 8 months, it was training 42 entrepreneurs across the UK. 3 years earlier, Elliot would have laughed at the idea. That alone made it worth doing. Carson and I became something steady. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but kind. He split his time between writing, mentoring young journalists, and editing ethics-based nonfiction. He never asked to borrow my spotlight, and I never asked him to step out of his quiet. One Friday evening, over mushroom risotto at the cottage, he asked gently, "Have you ever thought about what comes after this?" After what? The rebuilding, the proving, the need to outpace the damage that was done. I thought for a long moment. "I think there's a version of me that isn't running anymore. I'd like to meet her." He smiled. "Me too." A surprising invitation came from Cambridge. They asked if I'd consider a visiting lecturer role in ethical business strategy. I nearly declined. But Penelope said, what better place to disrupt the future than where it begins? So every Thursday for a semester, I took the early train, walked into a lecture hall filled with eyes expecting PowerPoints, and gave them stories instead. Real ones. One day, a student raised her hand. You talk a lot about the cost of silence, but isn't revenge also costly? I smiled. What I did wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. Revenge ends with someone losing. Reclamation begins with someone rising. They scribbled that down like scripture. Elliot didn't receive parole that year. I learned about it through a brief email from the legal clerk. He had failed to demonstrate rehabilitation or community accountability. I felt no satisfaction, just a gentle finality. Sometimes, justice has to live longer than the courtroom. That autumn, we received an international partnership offer. A Scandinavian housing initiative wanted to co-develop a zero-emission community in southern Sweden. It was ambitious, expensive, idealistic. In other words, exactly our kind of project. We said yes. 6 months later, I stood in the snow-dusted village of Kalmar, surrounded by timber frames, bilingual signage, and local contractors grinning in wool hats. One of them said, "We never thought an English firm would care about the air our kids breathe. Thank you." I didn't have words for that. Just a nod. Brooke got promoted to Director of Culture and Development. She deserved it more than anyone. What should my first initiative be? She asked me during lunch. Make work less lonely. She launched a peer circle program within a month. Voluntary, cross-departmental, focused on listening. 6 weeks later, someone wrote anonymously. Asterisk. I haven't felt this seen in 5 years. It's healing me in ways therapy couldn't. The night we crossed the 10,000th employee milestone, I sat in my office alone, staring at the dashboard. 10,000 people. All with names, dreams, parents, losses. I whispered to the quiet, I hope I've done right by you. And in my chest, a calm answered, you have. Carson proposed on a rainy Tuesday. No grand gesture, just 2 mugs of tea, a quiet living room, and a simple question. Will you build something permanent with me? I said yes. No hesitation, no fear. Just yes. We didn't have a wedding. We had a gathering. At the cottage. 30 people. No vows, just letters read aloud. Mine said, I spent years reclaiming what was mine. Now I choose what is ours. Every day, without fear. His said, you never needed saving, just someone who didn't mind your shadows. I don't. I love them, and I love you. There wasn't a dry eye on the porch that day. 1 year later, I returned to the same courtroom where it all began. Not for trial. For testimony. I had been invited to speak before the Parliamentary Committee on Financial Coercion. My book and my work had sparked legislative debate on inheritance fraud and fiduciary abuse. I wore gray again. The room was packed. Financial abuse doesn't always leave bruises, I said, but it reshapes lives. What we need now isn't sympathy, it's structure. Laws that don't assume a family member is always a protector. The panel nodded. Some even teared up. 1 megapixel stood after and said, Ms. Granger, your courage will shape the very laws that once failed you. That night, I walked home. No car, no escort, just feet on cobblestone and the knowledge that I had made it here. Fully, completely. I passed by a bookstore. In the window, a copy of Asterisk, Her Seat at the Table, sat between 2 bestsellers. Below it, a handwritten card. Times Asterisk. If you've ever been underestimated, read this. I stood outside and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I wasn't. Let me know when you're ready for part 8. The first letter from Priya came 6 months after the verdict in her case. She was 19, just as she'd been when she first reached out, but her words had changed. They were sharper, steadier. Symes Granger. Fimes won. We won. The court recognized the coercion. The debt was annulled. My uncle was ordered to pay damages. I used the money to enroll in architecture school. I just wanted you to know. I will build safe spaces, because you helped me reclaim mine. I kept that letter in my desk drawer. Not because I needed proof that the fight had been worth it, but because sometimes, on quiet days, it reminded me that my story had become a lantern, and others had used it to find their way. The West Sussex cottage was no longer just a sanctuary. It had become a hub, a place for reflection, mentorship, and gathering. Once a season, we invited 10 women, entrepreneurs, survivors, advocates, to spend a weekend learning, sharing, and restoring. We called it the table, because everyone deserved a seat, and because once upon a time I had been told that mine didn't exist. At one of these weekends, a woman named Marisol from Lisbon shared her story. My husband forged power of attorney while I was recovering from surgery. He sold my inheritance and left me with nothing. Until I read Lorelei's book, I thought I was the only one. Now I speak in courtrooms as an expert witness. She stood with her chin high, shoulders back, a flame no one had extinguished. Grainger Holdings reached a milestone in year 7, £1 billion in community-first projects. That included low-cost housing in Glasgow, refugee shelters in Kent, post-flood rebuilding in northern Wales, and joint ownership schemes in underserved boroughs. We didn't mark it with a party, we marked it with a mural. On the site of our London headquarters, a young artist painted a sprawling image of an outstretched hand planting a tree whose roots formed a foundation of faces. Underneath, in block letters, *, growth is what you make room for. *. Every time I passed it, I smiled. Not because of what we had done, but because of what we were making possible. Carson and I traveled less for business and more for breath. We went to the Faroe Islands, where the wind tasted like the edge of the world. To Japan, where a woman in Kyoto bowed and said, "Your words helped my daughter leave her marriage." To Morocco, where we sat on a rooftop and listened to calls to prayer echo into the stars. He wrote essays about it all. I just lived it. That was new for me. Not narrating, not fixing, just existing. Elliot remained incarcerated. Every year, I received a report on his status. He declined parole again, voluntarily. The note simply said, "Subject refused early release. Seeks no external contact." At first, I wondered why. Then I stopped. Sometimes silence is not punishment. It's peace. On the 10th anniversary of my father's passing, we held a community gathering at the cottage. It wasn't a memorial. It was a beginning. We invited every person who had been mentored, supported, housed, or funded through the ripple of my reclaimed inheritance. There were nearly 300 attendees. We built a temporary tent in the garden, string lights, a circle of chairs. People stood and spoke, one by one. Priya, Marisol, Molly, Brooke, Carson. And then me. My father left me something he never knew he gave, the resilience to build without approval. What my brother tried to take from me became the seed for something wider, stronger. This is no longer the story of one woman. It belongs to all of us now. The sky bloomed with stars. We lit lanterns and let them rise. The next morning, a small girl wandered into the living room while I was making tea. She stared at the fireplace. "My mummy says you made a house where people come when they forget how strong they are." I knelt beside her. "Do you think that's true?" She nodded. "And that it's the kind of house that remembers you even if you go away?" Tears burned my eyes. "I hope that's true too." She left a drawing on the table. A stick figure with a crown, standing next to a tree with roots that spelled safe. I pinned it to the kitchen corkboard. My days became simpler. Not less full, just more deliberate. Board meetings turned into walking discussions in parks. Performance reviews included emotional wellness goals. We hired a full-time in-house therapist. We published our pay equity report. And when one of our site engineers took paternity leave, the team sent him a basket of books and a letter that said, *be present. We've got this. The world changed, too. Legislation passed, new protections for inheritance-related coercion. Financial abuse now categorized under domestic violence statutes. A BBC series aired a 3-part documentary on survivor-led reform. I appeared in the final 5 minutes. Just a voiceover. We don't rewrite the past, but we do decide who tells the ending. At 41, I woke up one day and realized I no longer carried the weight of that boardroom confrontation like armor. It had become history. Not shame, not rage, just history. Carson gave me a card on our anniversary. It said, "You've always had the map. I'm just lucky to walk beside you." Grainger Holdings turned 10. I stepped down as CEO. Not because I had to, because I had built what I came to build, and now it was time to let it grow without me. The new CEO, Alina, was a 36-year-old former refugee who started in our community construction program and worked her way through engineering school on a scholarship we'd created. She stood on stage at her first all-hands meeting and said, "I watched Lorelai take back what was hers, now I will guard what belongs to us all." At the cottage that night, Carson lit a fire. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like I can finally exhale." I walked outside, barefoot in the grass. The wind curled around my ankles like a greeting. And somewhere I felt my father's approval, not because I had succeeded, but because I had done it on my own terms. And that was the inheritance no one could ever take. Let me know when you're ready for part 9. Retirement didn't arrive like a door slamming shut. It came more like a tide drawing out. One day I was reviewing contract proposals. The next, I was spending 3 hours baking sourdough, with no one to feed but Carson and myself. It was unnerving at first, the silence, the deceleration, but eventually I recognized it as something else. Space. In the months after I stepped down as CEO, I did something that shocked even me. I unplugged. No email alerts, no Zoom check-ins, no speaking engagements. I took a sabbatical from the entire public version of myself. I kept my phone off for entire weekends. Carson and I traveled by train through the Scottish Highlands. We read books on the porch. I started sketching again, like I had when I was 17, before my brother sold my future. I didn't realize how much of myself I had stored away in boxes labeled later, quote. Now I was finally opening them. Of course, the world didn't stop just because I had stepped back. Alina, our new CEO, was thriving. She sent occasional handwritten updates. Asterisk Belfast Initiative hit record approval ratings. Asterisk Barcelona Green School Project just broke ground. Asterisk Staff feedback, 97% say they feel safe being honest at work. Best stat I've ever seen. I kept every note in a leather journal. This wasn't ego, it was legacy. Proof that I hadn't just cleaned up Elliot's damage. I had built something that could stand on its own. Priya graduated from architecture school and took a role with our firm's international team. Her first design? A women's shelter prototype for high-risk neighborhoods. She named it the Ember House. Why Ember? I asked during a catch-up call. Because embers aren't the fire that burns, she said. They're the ones that survive, waiting to reignite. I nearly cried. That winter, I returned to the West Sussex cottage alone. Carson was on assignment abroad. I needed the solitude. Not the kind that isolates, but the kind that clears. Snow blanketed the hedges. Inside, the kettle whistled. I pulled out an old wooden box from the linen closet. Inside were relics I hadn't dared touch in years. The original deed to the cottage, the forged power of attorney, my father's fountain pen, and the last letter Elliot had ever sent. I lit a fire, laid each item before me, and began to write. Not a memoir. A goodbye. Not to Elliot, but to the war. Dear war, you taught me how to build a fortress, but you never told me I'd have to live inside it. You made me sharp and fierce and lonely. But now I choose something else. I choose quiet. I choose laughter that doesn't apologize. I choose community not forged in trauma but grown in soil, I turned with my own hands. Dazentayo, I don't need you anymore. I'm not just surviving now. I'm free. I folded the letter, slipped it into the fire, and watched it burn. It smelled like pine and absolution. In spring, Alina invited me to speak at the dedication of our newest project, the Granger Learning Center, built on the site of our first development in East London. I almost said no, but something in me whispered, this is a return, not a repetition. I stood at the podium before rows of students, city officials, and families. Behind me stood a building made of recycled stone, timber, and glass. Before me stood the future. My brother once told me I wasn't made for this world, I began. But what he didn't understand is that I wasn't trying to fit into his world. I was building my own. People applauded. But it was the silence after that I remember most. A silence that held respect, not fear. Carson returned from Brazil with a new notebook and a tan. You look different, he said. I feel unburdened. We walked through the orchard behind the cottage. What would you do, he asked, if there were no expectations left at all? I'd open a bakery. He blinked. Really? Yes, a tiny one, on a corner, with wild sourdough and lavender shortbread, and a bookshelf in the back. Then let's do it. 3 months later, the Hearth opened its doors in Chichester. Just 5 tables, no Wi-Fi, a sign that read, warm bread, warmer hearts. We didn't advertise. But people came. Locals, travelers, women who had read the book, men who needed quiet. And every Friday, I taught a baking class called Crumbs to Loaves. It wasn't about bread. It was about rebuilding. One day, a young woman lingered at the counter. She finally said, I don't know how to say this, but I'm the daughter of a man your company once took to court. I met her eyes, steady, kind. Then you're welcome here. We've all lived through someone else's bad choices. She exhaled. Thank you. She left with a loaf of oat honey bread and something lighter in her walk. Priya visited the shop one rainy afternoon. She looked around, grinning. You really did it. I really did. She nodded. I'll name my next design after this place. Not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. I wiped my hands on my apron. And what's that? That we can be more than what was done to us. I rarely spoke of Elliot anymore. When I did, it wasn't with venom, just clarity. He was the storm that revealed my roots. That's all. One evening, Carson asked, if you could go back to that first day, the letter, the betrayal, would you change it? I paused, then said, no. Because if none of it had happened, I'd still be small, still apologizing, still asking for space at someone else's table. He kissed my forehead. And now? Now, I build the table. Let me know when you're ready for part 10. They came for the bread first. By year 2, the Hearth had a loyal customer base, not just because of the wild fermented sourdough or the rosemary focaccia, but because of what the space had become, a sanctuary. People would sit for hours with a book, or nothing at all, just watching the steam curl off their tea. Strangers left anonymous notes in the corners of books for the next reader to find. Asterisk, keep going, it's not too late. Asterisk, you are not your origin story. Asterisk, today's a good day to forgive yourself. I never policed it, I just let it happen. Somewhere along the way, the Hearth became a living archive of resilience. Every Monday morning, I opened the shop myself. I liked the solitude before sunrise, the scent of yeast blooming in warm bowls, the way flour clung to the air like fine snow. Carson would join me around 7:30, balancing a notepad and 2 flat whites. Sometimes we worked in silence. Sometimes he read aloud from whatever manuscript he was editing. Other times we just sat, legs touching, grateful for the kind of quiet we never had to earn. Do you miss the boardroom? He asked one morning. No, I said honestly, but I miss the certainty, the feeling of forward motion. Then maybe this, he said, gesturing at the kneaded loaves, the bookshelves, the humming oven. Is the motion now? He was right. I kept teaching crumbs to loaves every Friday. We capped it at 6 students per session. Most came for the bread, a few came for something else. One woman, Claire, stayed late one evening. She'd barely spoken during class, but at the end, she lingered. I left an emotionally abusive marriage last year, she said. I used to bake in secret. When I read your story, I stopped feeling ashamed. She pulled a crumpled note from her pocket. I recognized it instantly. Asterisk, you were never fragile. They were just afraid of what you'd become if you realized your worth. It was a line from my book. She had written it down in her own handwriting. I reached for her hand. You're allowed to build a life you don't have to recover from. She nodded, eyes glistening. She came back every week after that. Alina sent me quarterly updates from Granger Holdings, though she no longer needed to. It had become a kind of rhythm between us. Times Q1, Project Ember House expanded to 3 new cities. Times Q2, annual retention at 91%. Transparency ratings highest since 2020. Times Q3, we've implemented equity bonuses tied to community feedback, not just revenue. You'd love this. Snumol, she always ended with a line in her mother tongue, Farsi. I never asked for a translation. Some things are better as private poetry. On the 5th anniversary of Elliot's conviction, I was invited to speak at a global symposium on financial abuse. I declined. Instead, I wrote an open letter. It was published in The Guardian. Asterisk, what happens after justice? Asterisk, it asked. Asterisk, if justice is the scalpel, then healing is the stitching. Slow, patient, meticulous. Most people will only see the scar, but you'll know the thread, the care, the reclamation. Don't rush the quiet. It's where your power gathers. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from Thailand, Argentina, Kenya, Germany, all saying the same thing. Thank you for reminding us that surviving is just the beginning. That spring, I received a parcel in the post. No return address. Inside, a bound manuscript. Title page, her seat at the table, screenplay draft 1. Attached was a note. Asterisk. I know you said no to a series, but I couldn't stop thinking about your story. If this isn't what you want, I'll shelve it forever. But I think someone else might need to hear it on a screen, maybe more than they need to read it in a book. See. Carson. I read it. It was beautiful. True, quiet. No sensationalism, just fire and ash and bloom. I called him. Let's do it, but on one condition. Anything. I narrate it. My voice, or no one's. He paused, then smiled through the line. Perfect. The series premiered on a small streaming platform with big heart. It didn't trend. It didn't win awards. But it changed lives. I received a letter from a woman in Michigan. Asterisk. My sister and I hadn't spoken in years after our father died and the will divided us. We watched your series together in silence. The next morning, we made breakfast side by side. Thank you for giving us that bridge. I framed the letter. I started writing again. Not for acclaim, for release. Essays, recipes, reflections. Eventually it became a book. Tnumisar Bread and Bone, Lessons in Building After the Fire. It wasn't a bestseller, but readers called it sacred. And that was enough. One summer, The Hearth hosted a reunion. Not planned, just organic. People who had passed through its doors over the years returned. Former students, mentored founders, survivors, advocates, friends. We set up tables in the garden, lit candles, served apple galettes and pear tarts. Someone played cello. Children chased fireflies. Priya brought her new baby, whose middle name was Lorelei. Carson raised a toast at dusk. To the woman who built a table for everyone else, and finally sat at it herself. I didn't speak. I just looked around and let the moment speak for me. Years passed. My hair grayed, my knees creaked, but my heart never stopped blooming. Elliot died in his cell at 60. Natural causes. Peaceful, the warden said. I went to his burial. No one else did. I left no flowers. Just a note. I forgive you. Not because you asked, but because I didn't need your apology to heal. At 70, I planted a new tree in the garden. A hawthorn. Symbol of protection, of rebirth. Next to it, I placed a stone with 5 carved words. This is where she stood. Not fell. Stood. And from there, everything grew. Let me know when you're ready for part 11. At 71, I received a letter written in crayon. The return address said Nottingham. The envelope smelled faintly of vanilla. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper with large, careful handwriting. Dear Miss Lorelei, my mummy says you help people who got tricked. I want to help too. I made this for your wall. Tilly, age 7. Folded inside was a drawing of a giant tree with smiling houses hanging from its branches, and a sign on the trunk that read, Asterisk, this tree is not for sale. Asterisk. I laughed. Then I cried. Then I pinned it beside my desk. The hearth was 10 years old now. It had become more than a bakery. It was now a cooperative, owned jointly by the staff and the community. We opened a second location in Newcastle, then a third in York. Each shop followed the same code. Times no Wi-Fi. Times no tipping. Times no hierarchy. Just bread, books, belonging. Every new location got a portrait of the first team at the original shop, hung beside the back door. We never labeled it. But we all knew this was the route. Carson retired from publishing, said he wanted to write poetry full-time. His first collection was called Weatherproof. It sold modestly, but in a cafe in Amsterdam, a stranger once told him, that book saved my life. He came home with wet eyes. Isn't it strange, he whispered, how everything we survive becomes a map for someone else? I took his hand. We are more than our maps. We are the forest. Granger Holdings, now simply Granger, was in its 15th year of impact-based development. Alina had become a legend in her own right. Her TED Talk, Designing with Dignity, had gone viral. She invited me to the 15th anniversary gala, hosted in a solar-powered auditorium we had once dreamed of on paper. I nearly didn't go. But Carson said, sometimes you need to visit the city you built, even if you no longer live there. So I went. And when Alina took the stage and introduced me not as a founder but as a seed planter, the entire room stood. I held the microphone and said only, what you grow in the dark matters just as much as what blooms in the light. Then I stepped down. And never looked back. Priya sent photos of ember houses opening in India. She'd moved there to lead international design for vulnerable region architecture. Her husband stayed in the UK with the kids, visiting when he could. It's not easy, she wrote in an email, but I want my children to know their mother put bricks in places no one else would. I printed the photo of her cutting the ribbon in Bangalore, pinned it to the kitchen wall. She'd worn the same scarf I gave her in her first year. It still had a flower stain on the hem. The screenplay Carson wrote continued to circulate. Independent schools used it in drama curricula. Advocacy groups performed staged readings. One young actress messaged me on Instagram. Playing you in our student production gave me the courage to confront my uncle. Thank you for teaching me what standing still and speaking truth looks like. I sent her a signed copy of the original memoir. She wrote back, I'll take care of your story, like it's mine now, too. It was. At 74, I became a grandmother. Not by blood. Priya's daughter began calling me Cotty Lore, unprompted. It stuck. She drew me as a superhero in a flour-dusted apron with a breadloaf shield. The caption said, my daddy friend fights quietly, I framed that too. Each year, we added a new branch to the table program. Now it included teen mentorship, post-incarceration entrepreneurship, and elder women reinvention circles. One woman named Lillian joined the elder circle at 81. She had never worked a job outside her home. After her husband died, she launched a small herb garden business that delivered door-to-door bundles with handwritten notes. She called it Twide and Groot's Strice. When she turned 85, we hosted her product at the Hearth. It sold out in 2 hours. She wept into my arms and said, "No one told me I could still start over. You did." Quote, Elliot's name rarely came up, but his shadow had finally dissolved. The work outlived the wound. The garden grew. The house stood. The world spun on. I wrote my final book at 76. It was short, a collection of letters, each one addressed to a version of myself. The girl who thought the cottage would always be hers. The woman who read the forged letter. Times the CEO who sat in her brother's chair. Times the baker needing strength into every loaf. The last letter simply said, "You made it. Koe days and Mordaster. You didn't just reclaim what was taken, Sunter Soker Sumfro. Who turned it into shelter. Koe days and Mordaster. Mordaster Sunter Sunter Soker Soker Sumfro. Mordaster Soker 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 Sumfro. And you invited others in. Diesen Mordasters Soker Sunter Soker 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 Soker. Mordasters. Mortar Soker Soker Soms. Let me know when you're ready for part 12. Final part. There was no announcement, no farewell tour, no final speech. When I closed the doors of the Hearth for the last time, I did it alone, just after sunrise. The floors still smelled like cinnamon and yeast. My apron still held the faint imprint of flowery hands. I locked up quietly, placed the key on the counter, and whispered, "Thank you." Not goodbye. Thank you. Because that little bakery and the life I built inside it had given me something even the courtroom never could. A home of my own making. I was 80. My joints ached. My handwriting had become slow, but deliberate. Carson's hearing had dulled a bit, but he claimed he could still recognize the difference between my footsteps and anyone else's from across the cottage. Like a fingerprint in sound, he'd say, smiling from his armchair. We had a rhythm now. Tea at 7, letters at 9, walks after lunch, candlelight dinner by the fire when the wind howled. We didn't talk about legacy anymore. We lived it. The documentary team reached out one last time. Just one final interview, a retrospective, something for the archives. I said no. But I offered a compromise. You can record my voice, one session, nothing rehearsed, just questions, one take, that's all. They agreed. We recorded it in the kitchen. I wore a wool shawl and sat in the same chair where I'd once read Elliot's final letter. "Do you think forgiveness saved you?" the producer asked. No, forgiveness didn't save me. Boundaries did. Integrity did. Slowness did. Choosing joy over vengeance did. Forgiveness was just the final room in the house I built. What would you say to someone who's just received their own betrayal letter? Grieve, rage, collapse if you must, but then build, brick by brick. You'll be shocked how solid the ground feels when it's made from your own hands. What are you most proud of? I paused, then said that I gave people the courage to stay when they wanted to run and to walk away when they were told to stay. Is there anything you regret? I regret all the years I thought I had to earn what I already deserved. Silence. Then the recorder clicked off. That's it, the producer whispered. That's everything. The audio was archived at 3 universities. I never listened to it. I didn't need to. I had lived it. That winter, Carson grew ill. The doctors were gentle. The news was not. It'll be slow, you'll have time, but not much. He chose to stay at the cottage. I moved a bed into the sunroom, placed fresh-cut flowers beside his pillow each morning. He wrote until the end. Short poems, small phrases, some days just a word. One morning, I woke to find a page folded into my teacup. Asterisk, I loved your fire, but I stayed for your quiet. He passed away 2 days later. No drama, just an exhale. And I swear the wind stopped outside for a full minute. I grieved. And I lived. I kept baking, even when my fingers trembled. I kept writing, even when the pages took days. I kept planting, even when I needed help kneeling down. I kept showing up to the table gatherings, smiling as women told their stories, holding their hands when the tears came. And every so often, a child would point to the old woman in the corner and ask, "Is that the lady from the stories?" And someone would whisper, "Yes, that's her." One spring, I fell. Nothing dramatic, just a slip on wet tile. But the doctors kept me overnight. Then another night. Priya flew in. Her daughter, now a teenager, taller than me, with her mother's eyes. "Time to slow down, Didi Lore," she said gently. I smiled. "I'm not slowing down, I'm just walking with more intention." At 87, I completed my final project. A book of letters, not just to myself, but to others. To the daughter overlooked. To the wife who's had enough, to the brother who didn't know better. To the quiet one who sees everything. To the woman who thinks it's too late. Each page a seed. Each sentence a light. I titled it, Tom's Asterisk, Still Standing, Notes from a Life Rebuilt. Asterisk. It wasn't published. I printed 500 copies and had them handed out, anonymously, in train stations and post offices and bakeries. Every book included a note. Asterisk. If this reached you, it was meant for you. Pass it on when you're ready. On my 90th birthday, the garden behind the cottage was in full bloom. Alina visited, now gray-haired and graceful. Priya's daughter brought her own daughter. The porch was full of women laughing, crying, baking, singing. Someone asked me to give a toast. I stood, bones tired but spirit light. And I said, "Once upon a time, my brother sold my inheritance, and I thought that meant the end of my story. But what he didn't know was that you can't sell what's already in your hands. You can't take the light from someone who's learned how to burn without permission." I didn't win because I fought. I won because I stayed. In the grief, in the rebuilding, in the joy, I stayed. And from there, I grew. They stood. They clapped. Some cried. And I sat back down and held my granddaughter's hand. She leaned in and whispered, "One day, I'll write your story too." And I said, "No, love, write yours. Just know, the ink is already inside you." That night, as the candles flickered and the cottage windows glowed, I stood at the garden's edge and looked back. Not with regret, but with awe. This had once been the scene of my undoing. Now it was the center of my everything. Lavender in the wind. Bread cooling on the sill. Women telling the truth. And in the center of it all, a tree. The hawthorn. Its roots deep. Its branches wide. And at its base, 5 carved words. This is where she stood. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.